Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where we share tales of resilience, love, and the power of forgiveness. Today's story follows Grace Evans, a woman who overcame betrayal and built a life full of strength and purpose. Join us as we explore the deep emotional journey of healing and redemption in the sprawling heart of Manhattan, where the skyline glimmers like a sea of diamonds. William Grant's name stood tall. He was not merely a man of success, but a symbol of ambition. A self-made billionaire who turned his fledgling luxury fashion brand, Grant Luxe, into an empire adored by celebrities and the elite. At just 38, William was the epitome of what the world called the American dream. Every stitch in his brand's garments, every design that hit the runway, bore the stamp of his meticulous standards and unrelenting ambition. But behind the polished surface of Grant Luxe was a name no longer spoken: Grace Evans. Grace wasn't just William's wife. She was the hidden cornerstone of his early success. Years ago, when Grant Luxe was nothing more than a fledgling idea, Grace had been there, her creative talent breathing life into designs that caught the world's eye. She had believed in William when no one else had, leaving behind her own dreams to walk beside him in his pursuit of greatness. They had met in the quieter days of their youth. William, a sharp-dressed dreamer with a fire in his eyes, had seen in Grace not only beauty, but a partner who could understand the scope of his ambitions. Grace, a promising designer with sketches filled with bold ideas, had been drawn to William's charisma and drive. Together, they seemed unstoppable, a team destined to carve their names into history. The early days of Grant Luxe were modest, filled with long nights and whispered promises. They worked side by side, William shaping the business while Grace poured her heart into the designs. Although her name was never on the labels, her influence was stitched into every piece that left their studio. For a time, it seemed their shared dream would bind them forever. But as Grant Luxe ascended into the stratosphere of success, so too did the chasm between them grow. William became consumed by his brand's meteoric rise, and his vision narrowed. Grace's contributions, once so deeply valued, became an afterthought to him. To William, she was no longer his partner, but a trophy, a reflection of the perfect image he wanted the world to see. The change was gradual at first. Late nights at the office turned into distant, distracted conversations. Lavish galas replaced quiet evenings at home. Grace began to feel like a shadow, ever present but unseen. She tried to bridge the growing gap, but every effort was met with cold detachment or thinly veiled irritation. The breaking point came on a glittering evening at a high-profile industry gala. Grace, determined to reclaim her sense of self, had designed a dress for the event, a bold, breathtaking piece that reflected her cultural roots and artistic vision. As she stepped into the grand ballroom, she felt, for the first time in years, a spark of pride in herself. She thought William would see her, truly see her, as he once had. Instead, his words cut her to the core. "Leave the designing to the professionals," he said in front of a crowd of onlookers. "This is a bit too pedestrian for our image." Laughter rippled through the room, and Grace's smile faltered. The humiliation was unbearable, magnified by the sympathetic glances of guests who quickly turned their attention elsewhere. That night, back in the penthouse they once called home, Grace stood before a photograph from their wedding day. In it, William was smiling, his hand clasping hers as though they were equals in every sense. She reached out to touch the frame, her fingers trembling. Where had that version of them gone? Where had she gone? The answer came in whispers at first, then in a torrent of realization. She had given up everything for William, her dreams, her identity, her voice, and in return, he had reduced her to nothing more than a supporting character in his story. The final blow came just weeks later. One evening, as Grace returned home early from an event, she found William in their bedroom, not alone but entangled with his assistant. The betrayal was devastating, but it was the indifference in William's eyes that truly shattered her. When confronted, he dismissed her with the cruelest of words. "You're not what I need anymore. You're nothing without me." Grace left that night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a suitcase hastily packed with essentials. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. She was done being invisible, done being diminished. As she walked out into the cold Manhattan night, the lights of the city cast long shadows on the streets. In her heart, a small, fragile resolve began to take shape. This was not the end of her story. Somewhere deep within her, the embers of her dreams still glowed faintly, waiting to be reignited. Unbeknownst to William, Grace carried with her more than just the scars of their fractured marriage. Within her was the beginning of a new life, a child William would never know, a son she would protect at all costs. For William, the years that followed were a blur of unchecked ambition. Grant Lux grew into a global powerhouse, with William at its helm, celebrated as a visionary. Yet, the more he achieved, the emptier his victories felt. He surrounded himself with wealth, beauty, and power, but none of it filled the void left by what he had so callously cast aside. Grace, meanwhile, began to rebuild, piece by painstaking piece. In her darkest moments, she clung to one truth. She was no longer the woman who needed William Grant to define her worth. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she was determined to walk it, one step at a time. This was the rise and fall of William Grant, the man who had everything and yet, somehow, lost it all. Grace Evans had always been resilient, but the years following her departure from William Grant's penthouse tested her strength in ways she had never imagined. She had walked away from everything she once knew: wealth, fame, and the comfort of a luxurious life, to start over, alone, in Sweet Auburn, a neighborhood in Atlanta where her roots ran deep. It was in this place, surrounded by memories of her youth, that she would rebuild herself, piece by piece, not just for her, but for the small life she carried within her. At first, life was a blur of struggles. Grace found work as a seamstress in a small garment workshop, doing tasks that required the kind of patience and humility she had long forgotten. She worked long hours inspecting fabrics, stitching seams, and cutting patterns. The work was grueling, and every evening she returned to her modest home, feeling the weight of her exhaustion. Yet, with every stitch, something within her began to heal. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of the world felt unbearable, when the shadows of her past life seemed to follow her. But as the days passed, the spark of creativity she had once abandoned began to flicker to life again. She started sketching in the evenings, drawing designs inspired by the simple fabrics she worked with during the day. They were modest, but they reflected the fire inside her, the same fire that had once made her believe she could conquer the world. Her journey wasn't a smooth one. Grace faced judgment and skepticism from those around her, especially the women at the workshop who had seen her as little more than a luxury wife turned worker. One woman, in particular, taunted her for fumbling with scissors, saying, "I guess someone who's used to living in luxury doesn't know how to hold scissors properly." But Grace's spirit, forged in the fires of betrayal, refused to break. She smiled softly, determined, and quietly set out to prove them wrong. By day, she worked tirelessly. By night, she sketched. Grace's sketches weren't of glamorous gowns anymore. They were practical, yet beautiful, and each design carried the weight of her journey, her struggles, her triumphs. They were more than just clothes, they were symbols of resilience. Then one day, after months of quiet persistence, her efforts were noticed. Isaac Thompson, a young fashion designer with his own small studio in the city, noticed her sketches and was taken by their raw emotion and beauty. He approached Grace with an offer she could hardly believe: a chance to work with him. Isaac had seen something in her that she had long forgotten about herself, a passion that had never truly died. Working with Isaac changed everything. He didn't just offer her a job. He gave her a platform to reclaim her voice in the fashion world. With Isaac's guidance and support, Grace began to design once more, each piece infused with the lessons she had learned from her pain, her growth, and her healing. Isaac believed in her, not just as a designer, but as a person, and that belief in her potential, slowly began to heal the deep scars William had left behind. But even as Grace's new life began to take shape, she carried with her the unresolved wounds from her past. The shadow of William Grant loomed over her. Though she had forgiven him in her heart, the anger and betrayal she felt still simmered beneath the surface. Yet, she knew one thing for certain. She had moved forward. She had created something beautiful from the wreckage of her past. And nothing, not even William, could take that away from her. Meanwhile, William Grant's life had become a hollow echo of what it once was. His empire, Grant Lux, continued to expand, but he was no longer the man he had once been. His success had brought him everything he thought he wanted: money, fame, power, but none of it had filled the emptiness inside him. William found himself standing in the cold, echoing silence of his penthouse, staring at the photographs of a life he had destroyed. It was on one of these nights, as he poured himself a drink and stared into the glittering lights of the city, that he began to understand the truth. The empire he had built meant nothing without the people he had cast aside. He had sacrificed love, family, and human connection for success. And now, looking at the cold, empty rooms around him, he realized that he had lost everything. The realization hit him hard. Grace had left him. She had walked away from a life of luxury to rebuild herself. And in doing so, she had found a purpose that had eluded him. He had humiliated her, cast her aside like an accessory. And for what? To climb higher, to have more. But none of it had brought him happiness. He thought of Grace and the child she had carried when he tossed her out, and his heart broke. She had found strength in the very place he had abandoned her, while he had fallen deeper into the abyss of his own making. For the first time, William felt the weight of his past, the harsh words he had thrown at Grace, the coldness with which he had cast her aside, reverberated in his mind like a haunting melody. He had been wrong, so terribly wrong, and yet there was no way to undo what had been done. Driven by a need for redemption, William decided to make amends. He knew it would be impossible to undo the damage he had caused, but he had to try. The first step was to reach out to Grace. He knew she had a life now, a life without him, but he had to make her understand that he was truly sorry for everything he had put her through. He arranged a meeting with Grace, through a mutual acquaintance, hoping that she might give him a chance to apologize. He had no illusions of her forgiving him, but he needed to speak the truth. When the day came, he stood outside her small office, unsure of what to expect. He had once been the center of attention, surrounded by power and influence. But now, he was just a man with nothing left to offer but regret. As he approached Grace, he felt the weight of the years pressing down on him. She had transformed into something far more powerful than the woman he had known. She had risen from the ashes of their broken marriage to become a symbol of strength, resilience, and creativity. Grace met his eyes across the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The years of pain and betrayal hung heavy in the air. And though William wanted to apologize, to make things right, he wasn't sure where to start. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and no words could erase that. "I'm sorry," William finally whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of his guilt. "I was wrong. I hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I regret every moment of it." Grace didn't reply immediately. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, anger, and something else, something soft, something almost imperceptible. And then, with a voice calm but unwavering, she said the words that would change everything. "You were right about one thing. William, you were wrong, and I've had to live with the consequences of your choices. But I'm not the same person I was when you left me. I've moved on, and so should you." With those words, she walked away, leaving William standing in the shadow of his past. He had sought redemption, but he had received none. Yet, as he stood there, the first faint glimmers of peace began to settle within him. Perhaps redemption wasn't something he could claim. Perhaps it was something he would have to earn, over time, by doing the right thing. Not for Grace, but for himself. Grace had triumphed. William had failed. And now, Both would continue down their separate paths, shaped by the lessons of their shared past, but driven by very different futures. Grace Evans stood before the mirror in her small but cozy studio apartment in Sweet Auburn, a neighborhood that had come to embody her rebirth. She had come so far since those early, painful days of starting over. The scars of her past, her marriage to William Grant, her painful departure from his world of luxury, and the years of silence were all still there, hidden beneath the surface, but they no longer defined her. In their place, a quiet strength had grown, a strength that no one, not even William, could ever take away. Her life had become a delicate balance between her work at Isaac's fashion studio and the growing success of her own designs. The collections she had started with Isaac were now being recognized in fashion circles. And her pieces, crafted from the heart, were starting to tell the stories of resilience and empowerment that she had longed to express. Each design, each stitch, carried not just fabric and thread, but the weight of everything she had overcome. She had become a symbol, not just of success, but of survival. And then there was Mason. Mason, the son she had carried when she left William, was now a growing teenager, smart, kind, and full of promise. Grace watched him as he sat at the dining table, sketching designs of his own, already following in her footsteps in his own way. The joy she found in his accomplishments was unparalleled. Mason was her anchor, her reason for waking up each morning with purpose. He was her redemption, the tangible proof that her painful past had not defined her. Yet, deep inside, Grace knew that there was still a missing piece. Despite all she had accomplished and all the love she had built around her, there was still the lingering wound of her past, the unresolved bitterness toward William. His attempt at redemption had come too late, and though she had forgiven him in her heart, a part of her couldn't shake the memory of the man who had once torn her life apart. But what was forgiveness, if not the letting go of that burden? It wasn't until one crisp autumn morning that she realized that forgiveness wasn't just about releasing William from the chains of his guilt. It was about setting herself free. She could never change the past, and though she might never forget the pain he had caused her, she didn't need to carry it any longer. The only way to move forward, to truly live without the constant weight of resentment, was to forgive. William, on the other hand, had been living in a world of self-imposed punishment. After their brief encounter, he had tried to reconnect with his own life, but the weight of his past mistakes was a constant shadow over his every move. Carter Luxe, the brand he had built with such ambition and ruthless drive, was crumbling. Public opinion had shifted against him, and the once admired CEO was now a pariah. His name synonymous with arrogance, neglect, and betrayal. His financial empire had given him everything, but it had left him with nothing in terms of genuine relationships. He knew he had to change, but the question that consumed him was how. His conversation with Grace had shown him that redemption would never come easily. It wasn't something he could buy or manipulate. It was something he would have to earn. But how could he earn it? What could he possibly do to make up for the years of damage he had caused? One afternoon, while wandering the empty halls of his penthouse, William came across an old photograph of Grace, one he had kept hidden away, tucked beneath a stack of papers, as though its presence could somehow be erased. He had never been able to throw it away. Even after everything, in that moment, it became clear to him, redemption wasn't something that could be handed out. It was something that would require action. And the first step was to reach out to Grace, not to ask for forgiveness, but to offer it. He knew that Grace had a life now, a life that was no longer dependent on him. She had moved on, built something of her own, and though he was certain she would never welcome him back into her world, he had to try. He had to acknowledge, for his own peace of mind, that she deserved better than the man he had been. He needed to apologize, not to get something from her, but to give something to her. His pride had nearly destroyed him. It was time to put it aside. Meanwhile, Grace's life had grown even more complete. Her designs, inspired by both her cultural roots and the years of struggle she had endured, were being showcased in various galleries. Isaac had become not just a mentor, but a true friend, a friend who had guided her through the darkest times and now celebrated her brightest moments. His belief in her had always been unwavering, and it had made all the difference. But it was not just Isaac who stood beside her. Mason, her son, had become her greatest joy and her greatest triumph. He had inherited her determination and Isaac's quiet strength. They were a family, a true family, and though they had not always been an easy journey, they were whole. It was during one of her showcases in New York that Grace came face to face with a decision that would change everything. She had to decide whether she could truly forgive William and release herself from the past, or whether it would continue to haunt her, forever altering her ability to move forward. The moment came unexpectedly. William, now a mere shadow of the man he had been, had arranged to meet her after one of her fashion shows. He stood in the back of the room, watching her with a mixture of awe and regret. He had not expected her to forgive him, but he needed to make one final attempt to express the sorrow he had carried for so long. When their eyes met across the room, Grace didn't hesitate. She had been carrying the burden of his betrayal for so long. But now, as she looked at him, she saw not just the man who had abandoned her, but the broken man who was seeking redemption in the only way he knew how, by confronting the pain he had caused. "I don't need your forgiveness, Grace," William said, his voice quiet and worn. "I just need you to know how deeply sorry I am for what I did. You didn't deserve any of it. I never deserved you." Grace felt the weight of his words, and for the first time in years, she wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. She was simply free. "I've forgiven you, William," she said softly, her voice steady and calm. "Not for you. For me. I carried that anger for so long. I needed to let it go." William's face softened, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of peace. Grace had done something that he had never been able to do for himself. She had forgiven, not because he deserved it, but because it was what was best for her own peace. And in that moment, William understood. Forgiveness was not just a gift to the person who wronged you. It was a gift you gave yourself. Grace's words, so simple yet profound, marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had moved forward, and now she could finally breathe freely, without the burden of her past weighing on her heart. With forgiveness came the clarity to see the future not as a series of obstacles, but as opportunities to love more deeply, to heal more fully, and to create something that would last, something that was built on the lessons of the past, but was not defined by them. Grace's life, her work, and her family were now the true symbols of her strength. They were the legacy she had built, not out of bitterness or pain, but out of love, resilience, and the understanding that the only way forward was through forgiveness. Thank you for watching and being a part of today's story. Grace's journey reminds us that forgiveness isn't just for others, but for ourselves, too. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. We look forward to sharing more stories of empathy and transformation with you.